This bit of information, which Crick strenuously suppressed during his life, is only one of many examples of a secret technostic history linking psychedelic use with recent advances in human knowledge. The creation of the personal computer and the internet was apparently fueled by crossover between techies and the psychedelic counterculture. This relationship is the subject of at least one recent book, What the Dormouse Said. The awareness of interconnectivity of consciousness, often induced by psychedelics, has been given visceral form through the continued development of the net and Web 2.0. For the first time since the 1960s, the government and the academy are doing scientific research into psychedelics after a 40-year break. The multidisciplinary approach to psychedelic studies, MAPS, is one U.S. group that is currently shepherding a number of projects through the tangles of government bureaucracy. MAPS-sponsored studies currently underway examine the use of psilocybin to treat obsessive-compulsive disorders, the possible efficacy of MDMA to help terminally ill cancer patients prepare for death, and the use of the West African psychedelic iboga as a treatment for drug addiction. Unconnected to MAPS, a recent Johns Hopkins double-blind study essentially replicated experiments from the early 1960s, giving psilocybin and placebos to volunteers who had never experienced a psychedelic before. 60% of the volunteers found their psilocybin sessions to be positive, and in some cases, spiritually transformative. While these results were unsurprising to anyone versed in psychedelic history, the study received surprisingly prominent media attention in the Wall Street Journal, on CNN, and elsewhere. While scientific study of psychedelics picks up again, there is also an increasing openness toward the legally sanctioned use of natural entheogens, God-releasing chemicals, in established religious ritual. In 1993, Congress passed the Emergency Religious Freedom Restoration Act in reaction to a decision made by the U.S. Supreme Court that removed some federal protections from the Native American Church, which consumes the peyote cactus during all-night ceremonies. In 2005, following this new trend, the court ruled in favor of União do Vegetal, a Brazilian religion that uses the visionary potion ayahuasca in its sacrament. Ayahuasca contains the psychedelic dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is endogenous to the human brain and is found in many plants. União do Vegetal is one of several authorized religions in Brazil that incorporate ayahuasca in their ceremonies and have official government approval as well as UN protection. Outside of the scientific establishment and the religious context, personal experimentation with psychedelics remains popular in various subcultures across the United States. As the archives of the Vaults of Erowid, www.erowid.org, make abundantly clear, there are now many more people exploring a wider range of psychedelic compounds, from natural plants to recently discovered synthetic chemicals, than ever before. While the official interdiction continues in this country, we are in the throes of a global psychedelic renaissance that is, in many ways, far more extensive than that of the 1960s. Erowid features trip resorts from individuals or small groups, sometimes taking substances in shamanic ritual, but often for purposes of inner exploration and hedonistic enjoyment. It is possible that the current opening around this long-suppressed area of psychedelic vision foreshadows another bout of intense legal and social repression. However, it is also possible that a more profound, almost subliminal shift is taking place in attitudes toward the use of these substances, whether for personal exploration, shamanic vision, religious rite, or scientific study. In a culture that is awash in prescription chemicals, drugs of abuse, and mood-altering SSRIs, it seems increasingly odd to ban a handful of plant substances and related compounds. Even LSD is closely related to a chemical found in ergot fungus that have been used by human beings for untold thousands of years. If psychedelics are making a resurgence at this time, this may be due to larger social forces. As in the 1960s, our civilization appears to have entered another phase of acute crisis, as well as, perhaps, evolutionary opportunity. To a large extent, the cultural and social movements of the 1960s developed in reaction to the Cold War, which nearly reached a devastating nuclear climax during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The awareness of humanity's hair-trigger proximity to self-inflicted annihilation inspired individual acts of courage and brilliance, and mass movements for social and personal liberation. It also led to widespread interest in psychedelic exploration as a fast track to self-knowledge and spiritual illumination. Rather than leading to instant enlightenment, the visionary insights, temporary dissolution of ego boundaries, and deconditioning from proscribed social codes often induced by entheogenic explorations helped some people to reevaluate their own role in society at that time. Today, we are faced with an intractable and unpopular war in Iraq that has already continued longer than the U.S. involvement in World War II. A rise in terrorism and a global ecological crisis of terrifying magnitude. Just as the 1960s generation had to confront the militaristic insanity of the Vietnam War and the Cold War, our generation has to reckon with the individual and collective mindset that has brought us to this critical threshold, quickly approaching the point of no return. While it would be the height of silliness to consider psychedelics in themselves as the answer to the massive problems now facing us, they continue to offer some individuals a means for looking at the world from a different vantage point, integrating new levels of insight. When we cast a cold eye on the current planetary situation, we discover that the industrial culture and excessive lifestyle of the affluent West masks an intensifying scarcity of resources that is unsustainable.
Night, Miss Nancy.
According to scientists, 25% of all mammalian species will be extinct within the next 30 years. Our oceans are 90% fished out, with the potential for an irreversible coil, after which production must decline, leading to higher prices and potential scarcity of energy in the next decades. While thousands of new, barely tested chemicals and genetically engineered species are introduced to the global environment annually, the human sperm count is declining 1% per year, down 50% over the last half-century, due to the spread of compounds such as pesticides and plastics that disrupt the endocrine system. Our efforts to find short-term technological fixes for the problems we create often lead to deeper errors and more dangerous unintended consequences. We are faced with the urgent task of changing the direction of global civilization if we want to avoid biospheric collapse and species burnout. Without romanticizing native cultures, we can recognize that in many cases their intimate and sacralized relationship to the natural world kept them from overshooting the carrying capacities of their local ecosystems. The modern fixation on abstract, quantifiable, and rational modes of thought has profoundly alienated us from the directly sensorial and mimetic forms of knowing and relating maintained by indigenous cultures, allowing us to treat the natural world as something separate from ourselves. The entheogenic experience can temporarily reconnect the modern individual with lost participatory modes of awareness that may induce a greater sensitivity to his or her physical surroundings, beside raising a psychic periscope into the marginalized realms of mythological archetype and imaginative vision. It is not a question of forfeiting our modern cognition for fuzzy mysticism, but of reintegrating older and more intimate ways of knowing that can help us find a more balanced relationship with the human and non-human world around us. It may seem unlikely that psychedelics could be rehabilitated, but who knows? Profound shifts in consciousness and culture happen in surprising ways, overturning the smug certitudes of academic experts and media commentators. New forms of awareness develop below everyday consciousness, gestating in hidden reaches of the collective psyche, long before they are allowed to be articulated and manifested as new social realities. What was once scandalous and impossible can become acceptable and obvious to a new generation, and doors that long seemed securely padlocked may swing open at the merest touch. As new paradigms of knowledge emerge, breaking through the crust of old habit and received conditioning, change becomes possible and sometimes inevitable. 1. General Introduction. A psychedelic experience is a journey to new realms of consciousness. The scope and content of the experience is limitless, but its characteristic features are the transcendence of verbal concepts, of space-time dimensions, and of the ego or identity. Such experiences of enlarged consciousness can occur in a variety of ways: sensory deprivation, yoga exercises, disciplined meditation, religious or aesthetic ecstasies, or spontaneously. Most recently, they have become available to anyone through the ingestion of psychedelic drugs such as LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, etc. This is a statement of an ideal, not an actual situation in 1964. The psychedelic drugs are, in the United States, classified as experimental drugs. That is, they are not available on a prescription basis, but only to qualified investigators. The Federal Food and Drug Administration has defined qualified investigators to mean psychiatrists working in a mental hospital setting, whose research is sponsored by either state or federal agencies. Of course, the drug does not produce the transcendent experience. It merely acts as a chemical key. It opens the mind, frees the nervous system of its ordinary patterns and structures. The nature of the experience depends almost entirely on set and setting. Set denotes the preparation of the individual, including his personality structure and his mood at the time. Setting is physical: the weather, the room's atmosphere; social, feelings of persons present towards one another; and cultural, prevailing views as to what is real. It is for this reason that manuals or guidebooks are necessary. Their purpose is to enable a person to understand the new realities of the expanded consciousness, to serve as roadmaps for new interior territories, which modern science has made accessible. Different explorers draw different maps. Other manuals are to be written based on different models: scientific, aesthetic, therapeutic. The Tibetan model, on which this manual is based, is designed to teach the person to direct and control awareness in such a way as to reach that level of understanding variously called liberation, illumination, or enlightenment. If the manual is read several times before a session is attempted, and if a trusted person is there to remind and refresh the memory of the voyager during the experience, the consciousness will be freed from the games which comprise personality and form positive-negative hallucinations, which often accompany states of expanded awareness. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was called in its own language the Bardo Todo, which means liberation by hearing on the after-death plane. The book stresses over and over that the free consciousness has only to hear and remember the teachings in order to be liberated. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is, ostensibly, a book describing the experiences to be expected at the moment of death, during an intermediate phase lasting 49, 7 times 7 days, and during rebirth into another bodily frame. This, however, is merely the exoteric framework from which the Tibetan Buddhists used to cloak their mystical teachings. The language and symbolism of death rituals of Monism, the traditional pre-Buddhist Tibetan religion, were skillfully blended with Buddhist conceptions. The esoteric meaning, as it has been interpreted in this manual, is that it is death and rebirth of the ego that is described, not of the body. Lama Govinda indicates this clearly in his introduction when he writes, "It is a book for the living as well as for the dying." The book's esoteric meaning is often concealed beneath many layers of symbolism. It is not intended for general reading. It was designed to be understood only by one who was to be initiated personally by a guru into the Buddhist mystical doctrines, into the pre-mortem death-rebirth experience. These doctrines have been kept a closely guarded secret for many centuries, for fear that naive or careless application would do harm. In translating such an esoteric text, therefore, there are two steps. One, the rendering of the original text into English, and two, the practical interpretation of the text for its uses. In publishing this practical interpretation for use in the psychedelic drug session, we are, in a sense, breaking with the tradition of secrecy and thus contravening the teachings of the Lama gurus. However, this step is justified on the grounds that the manual will not be understood by anyone who has not had a consciousness-expanding experience, and that there are signs that the Lamas themselves, after their recent diaspora, wish to make their teachings available to a wider public. Following the Tibetan model, then, we distinguish three phases of the psychedelic experience. The first period, Shikai Bardo, is that of complete transcendence, beyond words, beyond space-time, beyond self. There are no visions, no sense of self, no thoughts. There are only pure awareness and ecstatic freedom from all game and biological involvements. Games are behavioral sequences defined by roles, rules, rituals, goals, strategies, values, language, characteristic space-time locations, and characteristic patterns of movement. Any behavior not having these 9 features is non-game. This includes physiological reflexes, spontaneous play, and transcendent awareness. The second lengthy period involves self or external game reality, Shunyid Bardo, in sharp, exquisite clarity, or in the form of hallucinations, karmic apparitions. The final period, Sidpa Bardo, involves the return to routine game reality and the self. For most persons, the second, aesthetic or hallucinatory stage, is the longest. For the initiated, the first stage of illumination lasts longer. For the unprepared, the heavy game players, those who anxiously cling to their egos and fluid and ever-changing. Typically, the subject's consciousness flicks in and out of these three levels with rapid oscillations. One purpose of this manual is to enable the person to regain the transcendence of the first bardo and to avoid prolonged entrapments in hallucinatory or ego-dominated game patterns. The basic trusts and beliefs. You must be ready to accept the possibility that there is a limitless range of awarenesses for which we now have no words. That awareness can expand beyond the range of your ego, yourself, your familiar identity, beyond everything you have learned, beyond your notions of space and time, beyond the differences which usually separate people from each other and from the world around them. You must remember that throughout human history, millions have made this voyage. A few, whom we call mystics, saints, or Buddhas, have made this experience endure and have communicated it to their fellow men. You must remember, too, that the experience is safe. At the very worst, you will end up the same person who entered the experience, and that all of the dangers which you have feared are unnecessary productions of your mind. Whether you experience heaven or hell, remember that it is your mind which creates them. Avoid grasping the one or fleeing the other. Avoid imposing the ego game on the experience. You must try to maintain faith and trust in the potentiality of your own brain and the billion-year-old life process. With your ego left behind you, the brain can't go wrong. Try to keep the memory of a trusted friend or a respected person whose name can serve as guide and protection. Trust your divinity. Trust your brain. Trust your companions. Whenever in doubt, turn off your mind. Relax. Float downstream. After reading this guide, the prepared person should be able, at the very beginning of his experience, to move directly to a state of non-game ecstasy and deep revelation. But if you are not well prepared, or if there is a game distraction around you, you will find yourself dropping back. If this happens, then the instructions in Part 4 should help you regain and maintain liberation. Liberation in this context does not necessarily imply, especially in the case of the average person, the liberation of nirvana, but chiefly a liberation of the life flux from the ego, in such manner as will afford the greatest possible consciousness and consequent happy rebirth. Yet, for the very experienced and very highly efficient person, the same esoteric process of transference can be, according to the Lama gurus, so employed as to prevent any break in the flow of the stream of consciousness, from the moment of the ego loss to the moment of a conscious rebirth 8 hours later. Judging from the translation made by the late Lama Kazi Dawa Samdu, of an old Tibetan manuscript containing practical directions for ego-loss states. The ability to maintain a non-game ecstasy throughout the entire experience is possessed only by persons trained in mental concentration or one-pointedness of mind, to such a high degree of proficiency as to be able to control all the mental functions and to shut out the distractions of the outside world. This manual is divided into 4 parts. This first part is introductory. The second is a step-by-step description of a psychedelic experience based directly on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The third part contains practical suggestions on how to prepare for and conduct a psychedelic session. The fourth part contains instructive passages adapted from the Bardo Todal, which may be read to the voyager during the session to facilitate the movement of consciousness. In the remainder of this introductory section, we review 3 commentaries on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, published with the Evans-Wentz edition. These are the introduction by Evans-Wentz himself, the distinguished translator-editor of 4 treatises on Tibetan mysticism, the commentary by Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, and by Lama Govinda, an initiate of one of the principal Buddhist orders of Tibet. A tribute to W.Y. Evans-Wentz. Dr. Evans-Wentz, who literally sat at the feet of a Tibetan Lama for years in order to acquire his wisdom, not only displays a deeply sympathetic interest in those esoteric doctrines so characteristic of the genius of the East, but likewise possesses the rare faculty of making them more or less intelligible to the layman. W.Y. Evans-Wentz is a great scholar who devoted his mature years to the role of bridge and shuttle between Tibet and the West, like an RNA molecule activating the latter with the coded message of the former. No greater tribute could be paid to the work of this academic liberator than to base our psychedelic manual upon his insights and to quote directly his comments on the message of this book. The message is that the art of dying is quite as important as the art of living or of coming into birth, of which it is the complement and summation. That the future of being is dependent, perhaps entirely, upon a rightly controlled death, as the second part of this volume, setting forth the art of reincarnating, emphasizes. The art of dying, as indicated by the death rite associated with the initiation into the mysteries of antiquity and referred to by Apuleius, the Platonic philosopher, himself an initiate and by many other illustrious initiates, and as the Egyptian Book of the Dead suggests, appears to have been far better known to the ancient peoples inhabiting the Mediterranean countries than it is now by their descendants in Europe and the Americas. To those who had passed through the secret experiencing of pre-mortem death, right dying is initiation, conferring, as does the initiatory death rite, the power to control consciously the process of death and regeneration. The Oxford scholar, like his great predecessor of the 11th century, Marpa, the translator, who rendered Indian Buddhist texts into Tibetan, thereby preserving them from extinction, saw the vital importance of these doctrines and made them accessible to many. The secret is no longer hidden. The art of dying is quite as important as the art of living. A tribute to Carl G. Jung. Psychology is the systematic attempt to describe and explain man's behavior, both conscious and non-conscious. The scope of study is broad, covering the infinite variety of human activity and experience, and it is long, tracing back through the history of the individual. through the history of his ancestors, back through the evolutionary vicissitudes and triumphs which have determined the current status of the species. Most difficult of all, the scope of psychology is complex, dealing as it does with processes which are ever-changing. Little wonder that psychologists, in the face of such complexity, escape into specialization and parochial narrowness. A psychology is based on the available data and the psychologist's ability and willingness to utilize them. The behaviorism and experimentalism of 20th century Western psychology is so narrow as to be mostly trivial. Consciousness is eliminated from the field of inquiry. Social application and social meaning are largely neglected. A curious ritualism is enacted by a priesthood rapidly growing in power and numbers. Eastern psychology, by contrast, offers us a long history of detailed observation and systematization of the range of human consciousness, along with an enormous literature of practical methods for controlling and changing consciousness. Western intellectuals tend to dismiss Oriental psychology. The theories of consciousness are seen as occult and mystical. The methods of investigating consciousness change, such as meditation, yoga, monastic retreat, and sensory deprivation, and are seen as alien to scientific investigation, and most damning of all in the eyes of the European scholar, is the alleged disregard of Eastern psychologies for the practical, behavioral, and social aspects of life. Such criticism betrays limited concepts and the ability to deal with the available historical data on a meaningful level. The psychologies of the East have always found practical application in the running of the state, in the running of daily life and family. A wealth of guides and handbooks exist. The Book of Tao, the Analects of Confucius, the Gita, the I Ching, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to mention only the best known. Eastern psychology can be judged in terms of the use of available evidence. The scholars and observers of China, Tibet, and India went as far as their data allowed them. They lacked the findings of modern science, and so their metaphors seem vague and poetic. Yet, this does not negate their value. Indeed, Eastern philosophic theories dating back 4,000 years adapt readily to the most recent discoveries of nuclear physics, biochemistry, genetics, and astronomy. A major task of any present-day psychology, Eastern or Western, is to construct a frame of reference large enough to incorporate the recent findings of the energy sciences into a revised picture of man. Judged against the criterion of the use of available fact, the greatest psychologists of our century are William James and Carl Jung. Both of these men avoided the narrow paths of behaviorism and experimentalism. Both fought to preserve experience and consciousness as an area of scientific research. Both kept open to the advance of scientific theory, and both refused to shut off Eastern scholarship from consideration. Jung used for his source of data that most fertile source, the internal. He recognized the rich meaning of the Eastern message. He reacted to that great Rorschach inkblot, the Tao Te Ching. He wrote perceptive, brilliant forewords to the I Ching, to the secret of the golden flower, and struggled with the meaning of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. For years, ever since it was published, the Bardo Todol has been my constant companion, and to it I owe not only many stimulating ideas and discoveries, but also many fundamental insights. Its philosophy contains the quintessence of Buddhist psychological criticism, and as such, one can truly say that it is of an unexampled superiority. The Bardo Todal is, in the highest degree, psychological in its outlook, but with us, philosophy and theology are still in the medieval pre-psychological stage, where only the assertions are listened to, explained, defended, criticized, and disputed, while the authority that makes them has, by general consent, been deposed as outside the scope of discussion. Metaphysical assertions, however, are statements of the psyche, and are, therefore, psychological. To the Western mind, which compensates its well-known feelings of resentment by a slavish regard for rational explanations, this obvious truth seems all too obvious, or else it is seen as an inadmissible negation of metaphysical truth. Whenever the Westerner hears the word psychological, it always sounds to him like only psychological. Jung draws upon Oriental conceptions of consciousness to broaden the concept of projection. Not only the wrathful, but also the peaceful deities are conceived as samsaric projections of the human psyche, an idea that seems all too obvious to the enlightened European because it reminds him of his own banal simplifications. But though the European can easily explain away these deities as projections, he would be quite incapable of positing them at the same time as real. The Bardo Todal can do that, because in certain of its most essential metaphysical premises, it has the enlightened as well as the unenlightened European at a disadvantage. The ever-present, unspoken assumption of the Bardo Todal is the anti-nominal character of all metaphysical assertions, and also the idea of the qualitative difference of the various levels of consciousness and of the metaphysical realities conditioned by them. The background of this unusual book is not the niggardly European either-or, but a magnificently affirmative both-and. This statement may appear objectionable to the Western philosopher, for the West loves clarity and unambiguity. Consequently, one philosopher clings to the position, God is, while another clings equally fervently to the negation, God is not. Jung clearly sees the power and breadth of the Tibetan model, but occasionally he fails to grasp its meaning and application. Jung, too, was limited, as we all are, to the social models of his tribe. He was a psychoanalyst, the father of a school. Psychotherapy and psychiatric diagnosis were the two applications which came most naturally to him. Jung misses the central concept of the Tibetan book. This is not, as Lama Govinda reminds us, a book of the dead. It is a book of the dying, which is to say, a book of the living. It is a book of life and how to live. The concept of actual physical death was an exoteric facade adopted to fit the prejudices of the Buddhist tradition in Tibet. Far from being an embalmer's guide, the manual is a detailed account of how to lose the ego, how to break out of personality into new realms of consciousness, and how to avoid the involuntary limiting processes of the ego, how to make the consciousness expansion experience endure in subsequent daily life. Jung struggles with this point. He comes close, but never quite clinches it. He had nothing in his conceptual framework which could make practical sense out of the ego loss experience. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Bardo Todal, is a book of instructions for the dead and dying. Like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it is meant to be a guide for the dead man during the period of his bardo existence. In this quote, Jung settles for the exoteric and misses the esoteric. In a later quote, he seems to come closer. The instruction given in the Bardo Todal serves to recall to the dead man the experiences of his initiation and the teachings of his guru. For the instruction is, at bottom, nothing less than an initiation of the dead into the Bardo life, just as the initiation of the living was a preparation for the beyond. Such was the case, at least, with all the mystery cults in ancient civilizations, from the time of the Egyptian and Eleusinian mysteries. In the initiation of the living, however, this beyond is not a world beyond death, but a reversal of the mind's intentions and outlook, a psychological beyond, or, in Christian terms, a redemption from the trammels of the world and of sin. Redemption is a separation and deliverance from an earlier condition of darkness and unconsciousness, and leads to a condition of illumination and releasedness, to victory and transcendence over everything given. Thus far, the Bardo Todal is, as Dr. Evans Wentz also feels, an initiation process whose purpose it is to restore to the soul the divinity it lost at birth. In still another passage, Jung continues the struggle, but misses again. Nor is the psychological use we make of it, the Tibetan book, anything but a secondary intention, though one that is possibly sanctioned by Lamaist custom. The real purpose of this singular book is the attempt, which must seem very strange to the educated European of the 20th century, to enlighten the dead on their journey through the regions of the Bardo. The Catholic Church is the only place in the world of the white man where any provision is made for the souls of the departed. In the summary of Lama Govinda's comments which follow, we shall see that the Tibetan commentator, freed from the European concepts of Jung, moves directly to the esoteric and practical meaning of the Tibetan book. In his autobiography, written in 1960, Jung commits himself wholly to the inner vision and to the wisdom and superior reality of internal perceptions. In 1938, when his Tibetan commentary was written, he was moving in this direction, but cautiously, and with the ambivalent reservations of the psychiatrist cum mystic. The dead man must desperately resist the dictates of reason, as we understand it, and give up the supremacy of egohood, regarded by reason as sacrosanct. What this means in practice is complete capitulation to the objective powers of the psyche, with all that this entails, a kind of symbolical death corresponding to the judgment of the dead in the Sidpa Bardo. It means the end of all conscious, rational, morally responsible conduct of life, and a voluntary surrender to what the Bardo Todal calls karmic illusion. Karmic illusion springs from belief in a visionary world of an extremely irrational nature, which neither accords with nor derives from our rational judgment, but is the exclusive product of uninhibited imagination. It is sheer dream or fantasy, and every well-meaning person will instantly caution us against it. Nor indeed can one see at first sight what is the difference between fantasies of this kind and the phantasmagoria of a lunatic. Very often, only a slight abaissement du niveau mental is needed to unleash this world of illusion. The terror and darkness of this moment has its equivalent in the experiences described in the opening sections of the Sidpa Bardo. But the contents of this Bardo also reveal the archetypes, the karmic images, which appear first in their terrifying form. The Chunyid state is equivalent to a deliberately induced psychosis. The transition, then, from the Sidpa state to the Chunyid state is a dangerous reversal of the aims and intentions of the conscious mind. It is a sacrifice of the ego's stability and a surrender to the extreme uncertainty of what must seem like a chaotic riot of phantasmal forms. When Freud coined the phrase that the ego was the true seat of anxiety, he was giving voice to a very true and profound intuition. Fear of self-sacrifice lurks deep in every ego, and this fear is often only the precariously controlled demand of the unconscious forces to burst out in full strength. No one who strives for selfhood, individuation, is spared this dangerous passage, for that which is feared also belongs to the wholeness of the self, the subhuman or superhuman world of psychic dominance, from which the ego originally emancipated itself with enormous effort, and then only partially for the sake of a more or less illusory freedom. This liberation is certainly a very necessary and very heroic undertaking, but it represents nothing final. It is merely the creation of a subject who, in order to find fulfillment, has still to be confronted by an object. This, at first sight, would appear to be the world, which is swelled out with projections for that very purpose. Here we seek and find our difficulties. Here we seek and find our enemy. Here we seek and find what is dear and precious to us. And it is comforting to know that all evil and all good is to be found out there, in the visible object, where it can be conquered, punished, destroyed, or enjoyed. But nature herself does not allow this paradisal state of innocence to continue forever. There are, and always have been, those who cannot help but see that the world and its experiences are in the nature of a symbol, and that it really reflects something that lies hidden in the subject himself, in his own transsubjective reality. It is from this profound intuition, according to Lamaist doctrine, that the Chunyid state derives its true meaning, which is why the Chunyid bardo is entitled the bardo of the experiencing of reality. The reality experienced in the Chunyid state is, as the last section of the corresponding bardo teaches, the reality of thought. The thought forms appear as realities. Fantasy takes on real form, and the terrifying dream evoked by karma and played out by the unconscious dominance begins. Jung could not have been surprised by professional and institutional antagonism to psychedelics. He closes his Tibetan commentary with a poignant political aside. The Bardo Todal began by being a closed book, and so it has remained, no matter what kind of commentaries may be written upon it. For it is a book that will only open itself to spiritual understanding, and this is a capacity which no man is born with, but which he can only acquire through special training and special experience. It is good that such, to all intents and purposes, useless books exist. They are meant for those queer folk who no longer set much store by the uses, aims, and meaning of present-day civilization. To provide special training for the special experience provided by psychedelic materials is the purpose of this version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. A tribute to Lama Anigarika Govinda. In the preceding section, the point was made that Eastern philosophy and psychology, poetic, indeterministic, experiential, inward-looking, vaguely evolutionary, open-ended, is more easily adapted to the findings of modern science than the syllogistic, certain, experimental, externalizing logic of Western psychology. The latter imitates the irrelevant rituals of the energy sciences, but ignores the data of physics and genetics, the meanings and implications. Even Carl Jung, the most penetrating of the Western psychologists, failed to understand the basic philosophy of the Bardo Todal. Quite in contrast are the comments on the Tibetan manual by Lama Anigarika Govinda. His opening statement, at first glance, would cause a Judeo-Christian psychologist to snort in impatience. But a close look at these phrases reveals that they are the poetic statement of the genetic situation as currently described by biochemists and DNA researchers. It may be argued that nobody can talk about death with authority who has not died. And since nobody, apparently, has ever returned from death, how can anybody know what death is or what happens after it? The Tibetan will answer, there is not one person, indeed, not one living being, that has not returned from death. In fact, we all have died many deaths before we came into this incarnation. And what we call birth is merely the reverse side of death, like one of the two sides of a coin, or like a door, which we call entrance from outside and exit from inside a room. The Lama then goes on to make a second poetic comment about the potentialities of the nervous system, the complexity of the human cortical computer. It is much more astonishing that not everybody remembers his or her previous death. And because of this lack of remembering, most persons do not believe there was a previous death. But likewise, they do not remember their recent birth, and yet they do not doubt that they were recently born. They forget that active memory is only a small part of our normal consciousness, and that our subconscious memory registers and preserves every past impression and experience which our waking minds fail to recall. The Lama then proceeds to slice directly to the esoteric meaning of the Bardo Todal, that core meaning which Jung and indeed most European Orientalists have failed to grasp. For this reason, the Bardo Todal, the Tibetan book vouchsafing liberation from the intermediate state between life and rebirth, which statemen call death, has been couched in symbolical language. It is a book which is sealed with the 7 seals of silence, not because its knowledge should be withheld from the uninitiated, but because its knowledge would be misunderstood, and therefore would tend to mislead and harm those who are unfitted to receive it. But the time has come to break the seals of silence, for the human race has come to the juncture where it must decide whether to be content with the subjugation of the material world or to strive after the conquest of the spiritual world by subjugating selfish desires and transcending self-imposed limitations. The Lama next describes the effects of consciousness expansion techniques. He is talking here about the method he knows, the yogic, but his words are equally applicable to psychedelic experience. There are those who, in virtue of concentration and other yogic practices, are able to bring the subconscious into the realm of discriminative consciousness and, thereby, to draw upon the unrestricted treasury of subconscious memory, wherein are stored the records not only of our past lives, but the records of the past of our race, the past of humanity, and of all pre-human forms of life, if not of the very consciousness that makes life possible in this universe. If, through some trick of nature, the gates of an individual's subconscious were suddenly to spring open, the unprepared mind would be overwhelmed and crushed. Therefore, the gates of the subconscious. If the Bardo Todo were to be regarded as being based merely upon folklore, or as consisting of religious speculation about death and a hypothetical after-death state, it would be of interest only to anthropologists and students of religion. But the Bardo Todo is far more. It is a key to the innermost recesses of the human mind, and a guide for initiates, and for those who are seeking the spiritual path of liberation. Although the Bardo Todo is at present time widely used in Tibet as a breviary, and read or recited on the occasion of death, for which reason it has been aptly called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one should not forget that it was originally conceived to serve as a guide not only for the dying and the dead, but for the living as well. And herein lies the justification for having made the Tibetan Book of the Dead accessible to a wider public. Notwithstanding the popular customs and beliefs which, under the influence of age-old traditions of pre-Buddhist origin, have grown around the profound revelations of the Bardo Todo, it has value only for those who practice and realize its teaching during their lifetime. There are two things which have caused misunderstanding. One is that the teachings seem to be addressed to the dead or the dying. The other, that the title contains the expression liberation through hearing, in Tibetan, tosgrol. As a result, there has arisen the belief that it is sufficient to read or to recite the Bardo Todo in the presence of a dying person, or even of a person who has just died, in order to effect his or her liberation. Such misunderstanding could only have arisen among those who do not know that it is one of the oldest and most universal practices for the initiate to go through the experience of death before he can be spiritually reborn. Symbolically, he must die to his past and to his old ego before he can take his place in the new spiritual life into which he has been initiated. The dead or the dying person is addressed in the Bardo Todo mainly for three reasons. One, the earnest practitioner of these teachings should regard every moment of his or her life as if it were the last. Two, when a follower of these teachings is actually dying, he or she should be reminded of the experiences at the time of initiation, or of the words or mantra of the guru, especially if the dying one's mind lacks alertness during the critical moments. And three, one who is still incarnate should try to surround the person dying or just dead with loving and helpful thoughts during the first stages of the new or after-death state of existence, without allowing emotional attachment to interfere or to give rise to a state of morbid mental depression. Accordingly, one function of the Bardo Todo appears to be more to help those who have been left behind to adopt the right attitude towards the dead and towards the fact of death than to assist the dead, who, according to Buddhist belief, will not deviate from their own karmic path. This proves that we have to do here with life and not merely with a mass for the dead, to which the Bardo Todo was reduced in later times. Under the guise of a science of death, the Bardo Todo reveals the secret of life, and therein lies its spiritual value and its universal appeal. Here, then, is the key to a mystery which has been passed down for over 2,500 years. The consciousness expansion experience, the pre-mortem death and rebirth rite. The Vedic sages knew the secret. The Eleusinian initiates knew it. The Tantrics knew it. In all their esoteric writings, they whisper the message. It is possible to cut beyond ego consciousness, to tune in on neurological processes which flash by at the speed of light, and to become aware of the enormous treasury of ancient racial knowledge welded into the nucleus of every cell in your body. Modern psychedelic chemicals provide a key to this forgotten realm of awareness. But just as this manual, without the psychedelic awareness, is nothing but an exercise in academic Tibetology, so too, the potent chemical key is of little value without the guidance and the teachings. Westerners do not accept the existence of conscious processes for which they have no operational term. The attitude which is prevalent is, if you can't label it, and if it is beyond current notions of space-time and personality, then it is not open for investigation. Thus, we see the ego loss experience confused with schizophrenia. Thus, we see present-day psychiatrists solemnly pronouncing the psychedelic keys as psychosis-producing and dangerous. The new visionary chemical and the premortem death-rebirth experience may be pushed once again into the shadows of history. Looking back, we remember that every Middle Eastern and European administrator, with the exception of certain periods in Greece and Persia, has, during the last 3,000 years, rushed to pass laws against any emerging transcendental process, the premortem death-rebirth session, its adepts, and any new method of consciousness expansion. The present moment in human history, as Lama Govinda points out, is critical. Now, for the first time, we possess the means of providing the enlightenment to a clear light seen at the moment of ego loss. All individuals who have received the practical teachings of this manual will, if the text be remembered, be set face to face with the ecstatic radiance and will win illumination instantaneously, without entering upon hallucinatory struggles and without further suffering on the age-long pathway of normal evolution, which traverses the various worlds of game existence. This doctrine underlies the whole of the Tibetan model. Faith is the first step on the secret pathway. Then comes illumination, and with it, certainty. And when the goal is won, emancipation. Success implies very unusual preparation in consciousness expansion, as well as much calm, compassionate game playing, good karma, on the part of the participant. If the participant can be made to see and to grasp the idea of the empty mind as soon as the guide reveals it, that is to say, if he has the power to die consciously, and at the supreme moment of quitting the ego, can recognize the ecstasy which will dawn upon him then, and become one with it, all game bonds of illusion are broken asunder immediately. The dreamer is awakened into reality simultaneously with the mighty achievement of recognition. It is best if the guru, spiritual teacher, from whom the participant received guiding instructions, is present. But if the guru cannot be present, then another experienced person, or if the latter is also unavailable, then a person whom the participant trusts should be available to read this manual without imposing any of his own games. Thereby, the participant will be put in mind of what he had previously heard of the experience, and will at once come to recognize the fundamental light and undoubtedly obtain liberation. Liberation is the nervous system devoid of mental, conceptual activity. The mind in its conditioned state, that is to say, when limited, the nervous system in a state of quiescence, alert, awake, but not active, is comparable to what Buddhists call the highest state of dhyana, deep meditation, when still united to a human body. The conscious recognition of the clear light induces an ecstatic condition of consciousness, such as saints and mystics of the West have called illumination. The first sign is the glimpsing of the clear light of reality, the infallible mind of the pure mystic state. This is the awareness of energy transformations with no imposition of mental categories. The duration of this state varies with the individual. It depends upon experience, security, trust, preparation, and the surroundings. In those who have even a little practical experience of the tranquil state of non-game awareness, and in those who have happy games, this state can last from 30 minutes to several hours. In this state, realization of what mystics call the ultimate truth is possible, provided that sufficient preparation has been made by the person beforehand. Otherwise, he cannot benefit now and must wander on into lower and lower conditions of hallucinations, as determined by his past games, until he drops back to routine reality. It is important to remember that the consciousness expansion process is the reverse of the birth process, birth being the beginning of game life, and the ego loss experience being a temporary ending of game life. But in both, there is a passing from one state of consciousness into another. And just as an infant must wake up and learn from experience the nature of this world, so likewise, a person at the moment of consciousness expansion must wake up in this new, brilliant world and become familiar with its own peculiar conditions. In those who are heavily dependent on their ego games and who dread giving up their control, the illuminated state endures only so long as it would take to snap a finger. In some, it lasts as long as the time taken for eating a meal. If the subject is prepared to diagnose the symptoms of ego loss, he needs no outside help at this point. Not only should the person about to give up his ego be able to diagnose the symptoms as they come one by one, but he should also be. This shows that he has not reached a liberated state. Then, the guide or friend should explain the symptoms as indicating the onset of ego loss. Here is a list of commonly reported physical sensations. 1. Bodily pressure, which the Tibetans call earth sinking into water. 2. Clammy coldness, followed by feverish heat, which the Tibetans call water sinking into fire. 3. Body disintegrating or blown to atoms, called fire sinking into air. 4. Pressure on head and ears, which Americans call rocket launching into space. 5. Tingling in extremities. 6. Feelings of body melting or flowing as if wax. 7. Nausea. 8. Trembling or shaking, beginning in pelvic regions and spreading up torso. These physical reactions should be recognized as signs heralding transcendence. Avoid treating them as symptoms of illness. Accept them, merge with them, enjoy them. Mild nausea occurs often with the ingestion of morning glory seeds or peyote, rarely with mescaline, and infrequently with LSD or psilocybin. If the subject experiences stomach messages, they should be hailed as a sign that consciousness is moving around in the body. The symptoms are mental. The mind controls the sensation, and the subject should merge with the sensation. Experience it fully, enjoy it, and, having enjoyed it, let consciousness flow on to the next phase. It is usually more natural to let consciousness stay in the body. The subject's attention can move from the stomach and concentrate on breathing, heartbeat. If this does not free him from nausea, the guide should move the consciousness to external events, music, walking in the garden, etc. The appearance of physical symptoms of ego loss, recognized and understood, should result in peaceful attainment of illumination. If ecstatic acceptance does not occur, or when the period of peaceful silence seems to be ending, the relevant sections of the instructions can be spoken in a low tone of voice in the ear. It is often useful to repeat them distinctly, clearly impressing them upon the person so as to prevent his mind from wandering. Another method of guiding the experience with a minimum of activity is to have the instructions previously recorded in the subject's own voice and to flip the tape on at the appropriate moment. The reading will recall to the mind of the voyager the former preparation. It will cause the naked consciousness to be recognized as the clear light of the beginning. It will remind the subject of his unity with this state of perfect enlightenment and help him maintain it. If, when undergoing ego loss, one is familiar with this state, by virtue of previous experience and preparation, the wheel of rebirth, i.e., all game playing, is stopped, and liberation instantaneously is achieved. But such spiritual efficiency is so very rare that the normal mental condition of the person is unequal to the supreme feat of holding on to the state in which the clear light shines, and there follows a progressive descent into lower and lower states of the bardo experience, and then rebirth. The simile of a needle balanced and set rolling on a thread is used by the lamas to elucidate this condition. So long as the needle retains its balance, it remains on the thread. Eventually, however, the law of gravitation, the pull of the ego or external stimulation, affects it, and it falls. In the realm of the clear light, similarly, the mentality of a person in the ego-transcendent state momentarily enjoys a condition of balance, of perfect equilibrium, and of oneness. Unfamiliar with such a state, which is an ecstatic state of non-ego, the consciousness of the average human being lacks the power to function in it. Karmic, i.e., game, propensities becloud the consciousness principle with thoughts of personality, of individualized being, of dualism. Thus, losing equilibrium, consciousness falls away from the clear light. It is thought processes which prevent the realization of nirvana, which is the blowing out of the flame of selfish game desire. And so the wheel of life continues to turn. All or some of the appropriate passages in the instructions may be read to the voyager during the period of waiting for the drug to take effect, and when the first symptoms of ego loss appear. When the voyager is clearly in a profound ego-transcendent ecstasy, the wise guide will remain silent. Part 2. The secondary clear light seen immediately after ego loss. The preceding section describes how the clear light may be recognized and liberation maintained. But if it becomes apparent that the primary clear light has not been recognized, then it can certainly be assumed there is dawning what is called the phase of the secondary clear light. The first flash of experience usually produces a state of ecstasy of the greatest intensity. Every cell in the body is sensed as involved in orgastic creativity. It may be helpful to describe in more detail some of the phenomena which often accompany the moment of ego loss. One of these might be called wave energy flow. The individual becomes aware that he is part of and surrounded by a charged field of energy which seems almost electrical. In order to maintain the ego loss state as long as possible, the prepared person will relax and allow the forces to flow through him. There are two dangers to avoid: the attempt to control or to rationalize this energy flow. Either of these reactions is indicative of ego activity, and the first bardo transcendence is lost. The second phenomenon might be called biological life flow. Here, the person becomes aware of physiological and biochemical processes, rhythmic pulsing activity within the body. Often, this may be sensed as powerful motors or generators continuously throbbing and radiating energy. An endless flow of cellular forms and colors flashes by. Internal biological processes may also be heard with characteristic swooshing, crackling, and pounding noises. Again, the person must resist the temptation to label or control these processes. At this point, you are tuned into areas of the nervous system which are inaccessible to routine perception. You cannot drag your ego into the molecular processes of life. These processes are 1 billion years older than the learned conceptual mind. Another typical and most rewarding phase of the first bardo involves ecstatic energy movement felt in the spine. The base of the backbone seems to be melting or seems on fire. If the person can maintain quiet concentration, the energy will be sensed as flowing upwards. Tantric adepts devote decades of concentrated meditation to the release of these ecstatic energies, which they call Kundalini, the serpent power. One allows the energies to travel upwards through several ganglionic centers, chakras, to the brain, where they are sensed as a burning sensation in the top of the cranium. These sensations are not unpleasant to the prepared person, but, on the contrary, are accompanied by the most intense feelings of joy and illumination. Ill-prepared subjects may interpret the experience in pathological terms and attempt to control it, usually with unpleasant results. If the subject fails to recognize the rushing flow of first bardo phenomena, liberation from the ego is lost. The person finds himself slipping back into mental activities. At this point, he should try to recall the instructions or be reminded of them, and a second contact with these processes can be made. The second stage is less intense. A ball set bouncing reaches its greatest height at the first bounce. The second bounce is lower, and each succeeding bounce is still lower until the ball comes to rest. The consciousness at the loss of the ego is similar to this. Its first spiritual bound, directly upon leaving the body ego, is the highest. The next is lower. Then the force of karma, i.e., past game playing, takes over, and different forms of external reality are experienced. Finally, the force of karma having spent itself, consciousness returns to normal. Routines are taken up again, and thus rebirth occurs. The first ecstasy usually ends with a momentary flashback to the ego condition. This return can be happy or sad. loving or suspicious, fearful or courageous, depending on the personality, the preparation, and the setting. This flashback to the ego game is accompanied by a concern with identity. Who am I now? Am I dead or not dead? What is happening? You cannot determine. You see the surroundings and your companions as you had been used to seeing them before. There is a penetrating sensitivity, but you are on a different level. Your ego grasp is not quite as sure as it was. The karmic hallucinations and visions have not yet started. Neither the frightening apparitions nor the heavenly visions have begun. This is a most sensitive and pregnant period. The remainder of the experience can be pushed one way or another, depending upon preparation and emotional climate. If you are experienced in consciousness alteration, or if you are a naturally introverted person, remember the situation and the schedule. Stay calm and let the experience take you where it will. You will probably re-experience the ecstasy of illumination once again, or you may drift into aesthetic or philosophic or interpersonal enlightenment. Don't hold on. Let the stream carry you along. The experienced person is usually beyond dependence on setting. He can turn off external pressure and return to illumination. An extroverted and non-game state of ecstasy. And remember the following suggestions. Do not be distracted. Try to concentrate on an ideal contemplative personage, e.g. Buddha, Christ, Socrates, Ramakrishna, Einstein, Hermann Hesse, or Lao Tse. Follow his model as if he were a being with a physical body waiting for you. Join him. If this is not successful, don't fret or think about it. Perhaps you don't have a mystical or transcendental ideal. That means your conceptual limits are within external games. Now that you know what the mystic experience is, you can prepare for it next time. You have lost the content-free flow and should now be ready to slip into exciting confrontation with external reality. In the second bardo, you can reach and deeply experience game revelations. We have just anticipated the reactions of the naturally mystical introvert, the experienced person, and the extrovert. Now let's turn to the novitiate, who shows confusion at this early stage of the sequence. The best procedure is to make a reassuring sign and do nothing. He will have read this manual and will have some guidepost. Leave him alone, and he will probably dive into his panic and master it. If he indicates that he wishes guidance, repeat the instructions. Tell him what is happening. Remind him of his phase in the process. Urge him quietly to release his ego struggle and drift back into contact with the clear light. Preparation and guidance of this sort will allow many to reach the illuminated state who would not be expected to recognize it. At this point, it is necessary to inject a word of benign warning. Reading this manual is extremely useful, but no words can communicate experience. You are going to be surprised, startled, and delighted. A person may have heard a detailed description of the art of swimming and yet never had the chance to swim. Suddenly diving into the water, he finds himself unable to swim. So with those who have tried to learn the theory of how to experience ego loss and have never applied it. They cannot maintain unbroken continuity of consciousness. They grow bewildered at the changed condition. They fail to maintain the mystical ecstasy. They fail to take advantage of the opportunity unless upheld and directed by a guide. Even with all that a guide can do, they ordinarily, because of bad karma, heavy ego games, fail to recognize the liberation. But this is no cause for worry. At the worst, they just slip back to shore. No one has drowned, and most of those who have taken the voyage have been eager to try again. Even those who have familiarized themselves with the roadmaps and who previously have had illumination may find themselves in settings where heavy game behavior on the part of others forces them into contact with external reality. If this happens, recall the instructions. The person who masters this principle can block out the external. The one who has mastered control of consciousness is independent of setting. Again, there are those who, although previously successful, may have brought ego games into the session with them. They may want to provide someone else with a particular type of experience. They may be promoting some self-goal. They may be nurturing negative or competitive or seductive feelings towards someone in the session. This can quickly lead to karmic distortions and game hallucinations. If this happens, recall the instructions. Remember the unity of all beings. One to me is shame and fame. One to me is loss or gain. Jettison your ego program and float back to the radiant bliss of at-oneness. If you reach the clear light immediately and maintain it, that is best. But if not, if you have slipped down to reality concerns, by remembering these instructions, you should be able to regain what the Tibetans call the secondary clear light. While on this secondary level, an interesting dialogue occurs between pure transcendence and the awareness that this ecstatic vision is happening to oneself. The first radiance knows no self, no concepts. The secondary experience involves a certain state of conceptual lucidity. The knowing self hovers within that transcendent terrain from which it is usually barred. If the instructions are remembered, external reality will not intrude, but the flashing in and out between pure egoless unity and lucid non-game selfhood produces an intellectual ecstasy and understanding that defies description. Previous philosophic reading will suddenly take on living meaning. Thus, in this secondary stage of the first bardo, there is possible both the mystic non-self and the mystic self experience. After you have experienced these two states, you may wish to pursue this distinction intellectually. We are confronted here with one of the oldest debates in Eastern philosophy. Is it better to be part of the sugar or to taste the sugar? Theological controversies and their dualities are far removed from experience. Thanks to the experimental mysticism made possible by consciousness-expanding drugs, you may have been lucky enough to have experienced the flashing back and forth between the two states. You may be lucky enough to know what the academic monks could only think about. Here ends the first bardo, the period of ego loss or non-game ecstasy. Second bardo, the period of hallucinations, Chunyid bardo. Introduction. If the primary clear light is not recognized, there remains the possibility of maintaining the secondary clear light. If that is lost, then comes the Chunyid bardo, the period of karmic illusions, or intense hallucinatory mixtures of game reality. It is very important that the instructions be remembered. They can have great influence and effect. During this period, the flow of consciousness, microscopically clear and intense, is interrupted by fleeting attempts to rationalize and interpret. But the normal game-playing ego is not functioning effectively. There exist, therefore, unlimited possibilities for, on the one hand, delightful, sensuous, intellectual, and emotional novelties as one floats with the current, and on the other hand, fearful ambuscades of confusion and terror if one tries to impose his will on the experience. The purpose of this part of the manual is to prepare the person for the choice points which arise during this stage. Strange sounds, weird sights, and disturbed visions may occur. These can awe, frighten, and terrify unless one is prepared. The experienced person will be able to maintain the recognition that all perceptions come from within, and will be able to sit quietly, controlling his expanded awareness like a phantasmagoric multi-dimensional television set. The most acute and sensitive hallucinations, visual, auditory, touch, smell, physical, and bodily. The most exquisite reactions, compassionate insight into the self, the world. The key is inaction, passive integration with all that occurs around you. If you try to impose your will, use your mind, rationalize, seek explanations, you will get caught in hallucinatory whirlpools. The motto: peace, acceptance. It is all an ever-changing panorama. You are temporarily removed from the world of game. Enjoy it. The inexperienced, and those to whom ego control is important, may find this passivity impossible. If you cannot remain inactive and subdue your will, then may find this passivity impossible. If you cannot remain inactive and subdue your will, then may find this passivity impossible. If you cannot remain inactive, face next to his, and concentrate on the movement and sound of his inspiration. Breathe and feel the and the sighing release. This is the oldest form of living communication, the brotherhood of breath. The guide's hand on your forehead may add to the relaxation. Contact with another participant may be misunderstood and provoke sexual hallucinations. For this reason, helping contact should be made exclusive by prearrangement. Unprepared participants may impose sexual fears or fantasies on the contact. Turn them off. They are karmic, illusory productions. The tender, gentle, supportive huddling together of participants is a natural development during the second phase. Do not try to rationalize this contact. Human beings, and for that matter, most all mobile terrestrial creatures, have been huddling together during long, dark, confused nights for several 100,000 years. Breathe in and breathe out with your companions. We are all one. That's what your breath is telling you. Explanation of the second bardo. The underlying problem of the second bardo is that any and every shape, human, divine, diabolical, heroic, evil, animal thing, which the human brain conjures up or the past life recalls, can present itself to consciousness. shapes and forms and sounds whirling by endlessly. The underlying solution, repeated again and again, is to recognize that your brain is producing the visions. They do not exist. Nothing exists except as your consciousness gives it life. You are standing on the threshold of recognizing the truth. There is no reality beyond any of the phenomena of the ego loss state, save the illusions stored up in your own mind, either as accretions from game, samsaric experience, or as gifts from organic physical nature and its billion-year-old past history. Recognition of this truth gives liberation. There is, of course, no way of classifying the infinite permutations and combinations of visionary elements. The course contains file cards for billions of images from the history of the person, of the race, and of living forms. Any of these, at the rate of 100 million per second, according to neurophysiologists, can flood into awareness, bobbing around in this brilliant symphonic sea of imagery is the remnant of the conceptual mind. On the endless watery turbulence of the Pacific Ocean bobs a tiny open mouth, shouting between saline mouthfuls, "Order! System! Explain all this!" One cannot predict what visions will occur, nor their sequence. One can only urge the participants to shut the mouth, breathe through the nose. Urge the participants to shut the mouth, breathe through the nose. Experienced person of mystical bent can do this, and thus remain in serene enlightenment. The unprepared person will be confused, or worse, panicky. The intellectual struggle to control the ocean. In order to guide the person, to help him organize his visions into explicable units, the Chunyid Bardo was written. There are two sections. 1. 7 peaceful deities with their symmetrically opposed ego traps. 2. 8 wrathful deities who can be joyfully accepted as visionary productions or fled from in terror. Each of the 7 peaceful deities, bisexual father-mother figures, are accompanied by consorts, attendants, lesser deities, saints, angels, heroes. Each of the wrathful deities is similarly accompanied. Lights, symbolic objects, beautiful, horrid, threatening, seething, are likewise seen. If read literally, the Tibetan Book of the Dead would have you expect the master of all visible shapes, or his opposite, the fond, symbolic objects, beautiful, horrid, threatening, seething, are likewise seen. If read happiness and his consort, attendants and opposite on the second, etc. The manual should, of course, not be used rigidly, exoterically, but should be taken in its esoteric, allegorical form. Read from this perspective, we see that the lamas have listed or named 1,000 images which can boil up in the ever-changing jeweled mosaic of the retina, that multi-layered swamp of billions of rods and cones, infiltrated like a Persian rug or a Mayan carving with countless multicolored capillaries. By preparatory reading of the manual, and by its repetition during the experience, the novice is led via suggestion to recognize this fantastic retinal kaleidoscope. Most important, he is told that they come from within. All deities and demons, all heavens and hells, are internal. The student with a particular interest in Tibetan or Tantric Buddhism should steep himself in the text of the Chungit Bardo. He should obtain colored plates of the 14 dramas of the Bardo, and he should arrange to have the guide lead him through the prescribed sequence during the drug session. This will provide with a particular interest in Tibetan or Tantric Buddhism should steep himself in the text of the Chungit Bardo. He should obtain colored the experience reincarnated in the Lamaist tradition. The aim of this manual is to make available the general outline of the Tibetan book and to translate it into psychedelic English. For this reason, we shall not present the detailed sequence of Lamaist hallucinations, but rather list some apparitions commonly reported by Westerners. Following the Tibetan Todo, we have classified second Bardo visions into 7 types. 1. The source or creator vision. 2. The internal flow of archetypal processes. 3. The fire flow of internal unity. 4. The wave vibration structure of external forms. 5. The vibratory waves of external unity. 6. The retinal circus. 7. The magic theater. Visions 2 and 3 involve closed eyes and no contact with external stimuli. In Vision 2, the internal imagery is primarily conceptual. The experience can range from revelation and insight to confusion and chaos, but the cognitive intellectual meaning is paramount. External stimuli. In Vision 2, the internal imagery is primarily conceptual. The experience can range from revelation and insight. The experience can range from love and ecstatic unity to fear, distrust, and isolation. Visions 4 and 5 involve open and rapt attention to external stimuli, such as sounds, lights, touch, etc. In Vision 4, the external imagery is primarily conceptual, and in Vision 5, emotional factors predominate. The sevenfold table just defined bears some similarity to the mandalic schema of the peaceful deities listed for the second Bardo in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The peaceful vision. Vision 1. The source. Eyes closed. External stimuli ignored. The white light, or first Bardo energy, may be interpreted as God the Creator, the spreader of the seed, the power which makes all shapes visible, seed of all that is, sovereign power, the all-powerful, the central sun, the one truth, the source of all organic life, the Divine Mother, the female creative principle, seed of all that is. Magnificent revelation, both spiritual and philosophic, can occur at this point. marking the highest union of experience and intellect. But because of bad karma, usually religious beliefs of a monotheistic or punitive nature, the glorious light of the seed wisdom can produce awe and terror. The person will wish to flee and beget a fondness for the dull white light symbolizing stupidity. Persons from a Judeo-Christian background conceive of an enormous gulf between divinity, which is up there, and the self, down here. Christian mystics' claims to unity with divine radiance has always posed problems for theologians who are committed to the cosmological subject-object distinction. Most Westerners, therefore, find it difficult to attain unity with the source light. If the guide ascertains that the voyager is struggling with thoughts or feelings about the creative source energy, he can read the appropriate instructions for Vision 1. Vision 2. The internal flow of archetypal processes. Eyes closed. External stimuli ignored. Intellectual aspects. Energy. He can read the appropriate instructions. The source energy is law. Luminous waves of differentiated forms can flood through the consciousness. The person's mind begins to identify these figures, that is, to label them, and experience revelations about the life process. Specifically, the subject is caught up in an endless flow of colored forms, microbiological shapes, cellular acrobatics, capillary whirling. The cortex is tuned in on molecular processes which are completely new and strange, a Niagara of abstract designs. The life stream flowing. These visions might perhaps be described as pure sensations of cellular and subcellular processes. It is uncertain whether they involve the retina and/or the visual cortex, or whether they are flashes of direct molecular sensation in other areas of the central nervous system. They are subjectively described as internal visions. Another class of internal process images involves sound. Again, we do not know whether these sensations originate in the auditory apparatus and/or in the auditory cortex, or whether they are flashes of internal visions. Another class of objectively described as internal sounds: clicking, thudding, clashing, soughing, ringing, tapping, moaning, shrill whistles. These noises, like the visions, are direct sensations, unencumbered by mental concepts, raw, molecular, dancing units of energy. The mind sweeps in and out of this evolutionary stream, creating cosmological revelations. Dozens of mythical and Darwinian insights flash into awareness. The person is allowed to glance back down the flow of time and to perceive how the life energy continually manifests itself in forms, transient, always changing, reforming. Microscopic forms merge with primal creative myths. The mirror of consciousness is held up to the life stream. As long as the person floats with the current, he is exposed to a billion-year lesson in cosmology. But the drag of the mind is always present. The tendency to impose arbitrary, isolating order on the organic process. Sometimes the voyager feels he should report back his visions. He converts the life flow, but the drag Now I see a peacock's tail. Now Muslim knights in colored armor. Oh, now a waterfall of jewels. Now Chinese music. Now gem-like serpents, etc. Verbalizations of this sort dull the light, stop the flow, and should not be encouraged. Another trap is that of imposing a sexual interpretation. The dancing, playful flow of life is, in the most reverent sense, sexual. Forms merging, spinning together, reproducing. Eros in its countless manifestations. The Tibetans refer to the female bodhisattva's pushpema, personification of blossoms, and lasema, the bell, depicted holding a mirror in coquettish attitude. Keep the pure, spontaneous awareness of the mirror-like wisdom. Laugh joyously at the tricks of the life process, forever decking out forms in seductive, enticing patterns to keep the dance going. If the voyager interprets the visions of Eros in terms of his personal sexual game model, and attempts to think or plan, what should I do? What role should I play? He is likely to slip down into the third part of section. And he is rudely reborn as a confused, thinking being. Still, another impasse is the imposition of physical symptom games upon the biological flow. The new somatic sensations may be interpreted as symptoms. If it is new, it must be bad. Any organ of the body may be selected as the focus of the illness. People whose primary expectation when taking a psychedelic substance is medical are particularly likely to fall into this trap. It is safe to say that such bodily effects are virtually never the direct effect of the drug. The drug acts only on the brain and activates central neural patterns. All physical symptoms are created by the mind. Bodily sickness is a sign that the ego is fighting to maintain or regain its hold over an outpouring of feeling, over a dissolution of emotional boundaries. If the person complains of physical symptoms, such as nausea or pain, the guide should read him the instructions for physical symptoms. The negative, wrathful counterpart to this vision occurs if the voyager reacts with fear to the powerful flow of life forms. Such a reaction is attributable to the cumulated result of game playing, karma, dominated by anger or stupidity. A nightmarish hell world may ensue. The visual forms appear like a confusing chaos of cheap, ugly dime store objects, brassy, vulgar, and useless. The person may become terrified at the prospect of being engulfed by them. The awesome sounds may be heard as hideous, clashing, oppressive, grating noises. The person will attempt to escape from these perceptions into restless external activity, talking, moving around, etc., or into conceptual, analytic, mental sounds may be heard as hideous. Interpretation is different. Instead of revelation, there is confusion. Instead of calm joy, there is fear. The guide, recognizing the voyager to be in such a state, can help him get free by reading the instructions for Vision 2. Vision 3, the fire flow of internal unity. Eyes closed, external stimuli ignored. Emotional aspects. The first Bardo instructions should keep you face to face with the void ecstasy. Yet there are classes of men who, having carried over karmic conflict about feeling inhibition, prove unable to hold the pure experience beyond all feelings and slip into emotionally toned visions. The undifferentiated energy of the first bardo is woven into visionary games in the form of intense feelings. Exquisite, intense, pulsating sensations of unity and love will be felt. The negative counterpart is feelings of attachment, greed, isolation, and bodily concerns. It comes about this way. The pure flow of energy loses its white void quality and becomes sensed as intense feeling. An emotional game is imposed. Greed, isolation, and bodily concern. The glow of life is felt flooding along veins. One merges into a unitive ocean of orgastic fluid electricity. The endless flow of shared life, of love. Visions related to the circulatory system are common. The subject tumbles down through his own arterial network. The motor of the heart reverberates as one with the pulsing of all life. The heart then breaks, and red fire bleeds out to merge with all living beings. All living organisms are throbbing together. One is joyfully aware of the 2 billion-year-old electric sexual dance. One is, at last, divested of robot clothes and limbs, and undulates in the endless chain of living forms. Dominating this ecstatic state is the feeling of intense love. You are a joyful part of all life. The memory of former delusions of selfhood and differentiation invokes exultant laughter. All the harsh, dry, brittle angularity of game life is melted. You drift off, soft, rounded, moist, warm, merged with all life. You may feel yourself floating out and down all the harsh movement are mostly disappearing. Your control is surrendered to the total organs. Blissful, ecstatic, orgiastic, undulating unity. All worries and concerns wash away. All is gained as everything is given up. There is organic revelation. Every cell in your body is singing its song of freedom. The entire biological universe is in harmony, liberated from the censorship and control used by your restricted ambitions. But wait, you are disappearing into the unity. You are being swallowed up by the ecstatic undulation. Your ego, that one tiny remaining strand of self, screams, "Stop!" You are terrified by the pull of the glorious, dazzling, transparent, radiant red light. You wrench yourself out of the life flow, drawn by your intense attachment to your old desires. There is a terrible rending as your roots tear out of the life matrix, a ripping of your fibers and veins away from the greater body to which you were attached. And when you have cut yourself off from the attachment to your old desires, ecstasy ceases. Your limbs harden and stiffen into angular forms. Your plastic doll body has regained its orientation. There you sit, isolated from the stream of life, impotent master of your desires and appetites, miserable. While you are floating down the evolutionary river, There comes a sense of limitless, selfless power, the delight of flowing cosmic belongingness, the astounding discovery that consciousness can tune in to an infinite number of organic levels. There are billions of cellular processes in your body, each with its universe of experience, an endless variety of ecstasies. The simple joys and pains and burdens of your ego represent one set of experiences, repetitious, dusty set. As you slip into the fire flow of biological energy, series after series of experiential sets flash by. You are no longer encapsulated in the structure of ego and tribe, but through panic and a desire to latch on to the familiar, you shut off the flow, open your eyes. Then the flowingness is lost. The potential to flash by. Your fear and desire to control have driven you to settle for one static site of consciousness. To use the Eastern or genetic metaphor, you have frozen the dance of energy and committed yourself to one incarnation. And you have done it out of fear. When this happens, there are several steps which can take you back to the biological flow and from there to the first bar down. First, close your eyes. Lie on your stomach and let your body sink through the floor. Merge with the surroundings. Feel the hard, square edges of your body soften and start to move in the bloodstream. Let the rhythm of breathing become tide flow. Bodily contact is probably the most effective method of softening hardened surfaces. No movement, no body games. Close physical contact with another invariably brings about the unity of fire flow. Your blood begins to flow into the other's body. His breathing pours into your lungs. You both drift down the capillary river. Another form of life process images is the flow of auditory sensations, the endless series of abstract sound. Flow into the other's body. His breathing pours. The emotional reaction to these can be neutral or can involve intense feelings of unity or of annoyed fear. The positive reaction occurs when the subject merges with the sound flow. The thudding drum of the heart is sensed as the basic anthem of humanity. The whooshing sough of the breath as the rushing river of all life. Overwhelming feelings of love, gratitude, and oneness funnel into the moment of sound, into each note of the biological concerto. But, as always, the voyager may intrude his personality with its wants and opinions. He may not like the noise. His judgmental ego may be aesthetically offended by the sounds of life. The heart thud is, after all, monotonous. The natural music of the inner ear, with its clicks and hums and whistles, lacks the romantic symmetries of Beethoven. The terrible separation of me from my body occurs. Horrible, out of my control, turn it off. The trained guide can usually sense when ego attachment threatens to pull the person out of the unitive flow. At this time, he can guide the voyager by reading the instructions for Vision 3. Vision 4. The wave vibration structure of external forms. Eyes open or rapt involvement with external stimuli, intellectual aspects. The pure, content-free light of the first bardo probably involves basic electrical wave energy. This is nameless. Eyes open or rapt involvement with now possess. Some future atomic physicists may be able to classify this energy. Perhaps it will always be ineffable for a nervous system such as that of Homo sapiens. Can an organic system comprehend the vastly more efficient inorganic? At any event, most persons, even the most illuminated, find it impossible to maintain experiential contact with this void light and slip back to imposing mental structures, hallucinatory and revelatory, upon the flow. Thus, we are brought to another frequent vision, which involves intense, rapt, unitive awareness of external stimuli. If the eyes are open, this super reality effect can be visual. The penetrating impact of other stimuli can also set off revelatory imagery. It comes about this way. The subject's awareness is suddenly invaded by an outside stimulus. His attention is captured, but his old conceptual mind is not functioning. But other sensitivities are engaged. He experiences direct sensation, the raw isness. He sees not objects, but patterns of light waves. He hears not music or meaningful sound, but acoustic waves. He is struck by the sudden revelation that all sensation is direct sensation, the raw isness. He sees not objects. The world around him, which heretofore had an illusory solidity, is nothing more than a play of physical waves. That he is involved in a cosmic television show which has no more substantiality than the images on his TV picture tube. The atomic structure of matter is, of course, known to an illusory solidity, is nothing more than a play of physical waves. That he is involved but never experienced by the adult except in states of intense altered consciousness. Learning from a physics textbook about the wave structure of matter is one thing. Experience being in it with the old, familiar, gross hallucinatory comfort of solid things gone and unavailable is quite another. If these super real visions involve wave phenomena, then the external world takes on a radiance and a revelation that is staggeringly clear. The experienced insight that the world of phenomena exists in the form of waves, electronic images, can produce a sense of illuminated power. Everything is experienced as consciousness. These exultant radiations should be recognized as internal processes. You should not attempt to control or conceptualize. That can come later. There is the danger of hallucinatory freezing. The subject rushes back, sometimes literally, to the three-dimensional reality, convinced of the fixed truth of one experienced revelation. Many misguided mystics and many persons called insane have fallen into this ambuscade. This is like making a still photograph of a television pattern and shouting that one has finally seized the truth. All is ecstatic, electric Maya, the 2 billion-year dance of rays. No one part of it is more real than another. Everything at all moments is shimmering with all the meaning. So far, we have considered the positive radiance of clarity. But there are fearful negative aspects of the fourth vision. When the subject senses that his world is fragmenting into waves, he may become terrified. He, me, I are dissolving. The world around me is supposed to sit static and dead, quietly awaiting my manipulation. But these passive things have changed into a shimmering dance of living energy. The Maya nature of phenomena creates panic. Where is the solid base? Everything, every concept, every form upon which one rests one's mind collapses into electrical vibrations, lacking solidity. The face of the guide, or of one's beloved friends, becomes a dancing mosaic of impulses on one's cortex. My consciousness has created everything of which I am conscious. I have kinescoped my world, my loved ones, myself. All are just shimmering energy patterns. Instead of clarity and exultant power, there is confusion. The subject staggers around, grasping at electron patterns, striving to freeze them back into the familiar robot forms. All solidity is gone. All phenomena are paper images pasted on the glass screen of consciousness. For the unprepared, or for the person whose karmic residue stresses control, the discovery of the wave nature of all structure, the Maya revelation, is a disastrous web of uncertainty. We have discussed only the visual aspects of the fourth vision. Auditory are of equal importance. Here, the solid, labeled nature of auditory patterns is lost, and the mechanical impact of sound hitting the eardrum is registered. In some cases, sound becomes converted into pure sensation, and synesthesia, mixture of sense modalities, occurs. Sounds are experienced as colors. External sensations hitting the cortex are recorded as molecular events, ineffable. The most dramatic auditory visions occur with music. Just as any object radiates a pattern of electrons and can become the essence of all energy, so can any note of music be sensed as naked energy, trembling in space, timeless. The movement of notes, like the shuttling of oscillograph beams, each capturing all energy, the electric core of the universe. Nothing existing except the needle-clear resonance on the tympanic membrane. Unforgettable revelations about the nature of reality occur at these moments. But the hellish interpretation is also possible. As the learned structure of sound collapses, the direct impact of waves can be sensed as noise. For one who is compelled to institute order, his order, on the world around him, it is at least annoying and often disturbing to have the raw tattoo of sound resonating in consciousness. Noise! What an irreverent concept. Is not everything noise, all sensation, the divine pattern of wave energy, meaningless only to those who insist on imposing their own meaning? Preparation is the key to serene passage through this visionary territory. The subject who has studied this manual will be able, when face to face with the phenomenon, to recognize and flow with it. The sensitive guide will be ready to pick up on any clue that the subject is wandering in the fourth vision. If the voyager's eyes are open, indicating visual reactions, he can read the instructions for Vision 4. If the guide senses that the voyager is experiencing the fragmentation of external sound into wave vibration, he can amend the instructions appropriately, changing the visual references to auditory. Vision 5. The vibratory waves of external unity. Eyes open or rapt involvement with external stimuli, emotional aspects. As the learned perceptions disappear and the structure of the external world disintegrates into direct wave phenomena, the aim is to maintain a pure, content-free awareness. First Bardo. Despite the preparations, one is likely to be led backwards by one's own mental inclinations into too hallucinatory or revelatory interpretations of reality. One reaction leads to the intellectual clarity or frightened confusion of the forced vision just described. Another interpretation is the emotional reaction to the fragmentation of differentiated forms. One can be engulfed in ecstatic unity, or one can slip into isolated egotism. The Bardo Todo calls the former the wisdom of equality, and the latter the quagmire of worldly existence accruing from violent egotism. In the state of radiant unity, one senses that there is only one network of energy in the universe, and that all things and all sentient beings are momentary manifestations of the single pattern. When egotistic interpretations are imposed on the fifth vision, the plastic doll phenomena are experienced. Differentiated forms are seen as inorganic, dull, mass-produced, shabby, plastic, and all persons, including self, are seen as lifeless mannequins isolated from the vibrant dance of energy, which has been lost. The experiential data of this vision are similar to that of the fourth vision. All artifactual learned structure collapses back to energy vibrations. The awareness is dominated not by revelatory clarity, but by shimmering unity. The subject is entranced by the silent, whirling play of forces. Exquisite forms dance by him. All surrounding objects radiate energy, brilliant emanations. His own body is seen as a play of forces. If he looks in a mirror, he sees a shining mosaic of particles. The sense of his own wave structure becomes stronger, a feeling of melting, floating off. The body is no longer a separate unit, but a cluster of vibrations, sending and receiving energy, a phase of the dance of energy which has been going on for millennia. A sense of profound oneness disappear before the ecstatic union of all in one. All gestures, words, acts, and events are equivalent in value. All are manifestations of the one consciousness which pervades everything. You, I, and he are gone. My thoughts are ours. Your feelings are mine. Communication is unnecessary, since complete communion exists. A person can sense another's feeling and mood directly, as if they were his own. By a glance, whole lifetimes and words can be transmitted. If all are at peace, the vibrations are in phase. If there is discord, out-of-phase vibrations will be set up, which will be felt like discordant music. Bodies melt into waves. Objects in the environment, lights, trees, plants, flowers, seem to open and welcome. They are part of you. You are both simply pulses of the same vibrations. A pure feeling of ecstatic harmony with all beings, the key of this vision. But as before, terrors can occur. Unity requires ecstatic loss of ego brings fright to the unprepared. The fragmentation of form into waves can bring the most terrible fear known to man, the ultimate epistemological revelation. The fact of the matter is that all other forms of matter are momentary clusters of energy. We are little more than flickers on a multi-dimensional television screen. This realization, directly experienced, can be delightful. You suddenly wake up from the delusion of separate form and hook up to the cosmic dance. Consciousness slides along the wave matrices, silently at the speed of light. The terror comes with the discovery of transience. Nothing is fixed, no form solid. Everything you can experience is nothing but electrical waves. You feel ultimately a great television producer. Around you are lifeless television robots. The world around you is a facade. Stage. You are a helpless marionette, a plastic doll in a plastic world. If others attempt to help, they are seen as wooden, waxen, feelingless, cold, grotesque, maniacal space fiction monsters. You are unable to feel. I am dead. I will never live and feel again. In wild panic, you may attempt to force feeling back by action, by shouting. You will then enter the third part of the stage and be reborn in an unpleasant way. The best method to escape from fifth vision terrors is to remember this manual, relax, and swing with the wave dance, or to communicate to the guide that you are in a plastic doll phase, and he will guide you back. Another solution is to move to the internal biological flow. Follow the instructions given in the third vision. Close your eyes, lie prone, seek bodily contact, float down into your bodily stream. In so doing, you are recapitulating the evolutionary sequence. For billions of years, inorganic energy danced the cosmic round before the biological rhythm began. Don't rush it. If the guide senses that the person is experiencing plastic doll visions or is afraid of the uncontrollability of his own fears, he should read to him the instructions for Vision 5. Vision 6, the retinal circus. Each of the second Bardo visions thus far described was one aspect of the experiencing of reality. The inner fire or outer waves, apprehended intellectually or emotionally. Each vision with its correspondence traps. Each of the peaceful deities appears with its attendant wrathful deities. To maintain any of these visions for any length of time requires a certain degree of concentration or one-pointedness of mind, as well as the ability to recognize them and not to be afraid. Thus, for most persons, the experience may pass through one or more of these phases without the voyager being able to hold them or stay with them. He may open and close his eyes. He may become alternately absorbed in internal sensations and external forms. The experience may be chaotic, beautiful, thrilling, incomprehensible, magical, ever-changing. He will travel freely through many worlds of experience, from direct contact with life process forms and images. He may pass to visions of human game forms. He may see and understand with unimagined clarity and brilliance various social and self-games that he and others play. His own struggles in karmic game existence will appear pitiful and laughable. Ecstatic freedom of consciousness is the keynote of this vision. Exploration of unimagined realms, theatrical adventures, plays within plays within plays. Symbols change into things symbolized, and vice versa. Words become things. Thoughts are music. Music is smelled. Sounds are touched. Complete interchangeability of the senses. All things are possible. All feelings are possible. A person may try on various moods, like so many pieces of clothing. Subjects and objects whirl, transform, change into each other, merge, fuse, disperse again. External objects dance and sing. The mind plays upon them as upon a musical instrument. They assume any form, significance, or quality upon command. They are admired, adored, analyzed, examined, changed, made beautiful or ugly, large or small, important or trivial, useful, dangerous, magical, or incomprehensible. They may be reacted to with wonder, amazement, humor, veneration, love, disgust, fascination, horror, delight, fear, ecstasy. Like a computer with unlimited access to any programs, the mind roams free. Personal and racial memories bubble up to the surface of consciousness, interplay with fantasies, wishes, dreams, and external objects. A present event becomes charged with profound emotional significance. A cosmic phenomenon becomes identical with some personal quirk. Metaphysical problems are juggled and bounced around. Pure primary process, spontaneous outpouring of association, opposites merging, images fusing, condensing, shifting, collapsing, expanding, merging, connecting. This kaleidoscopic vision of game reality may be frightening and confusing to an ill-prepared subject. Instead of exquisite clarity of many-leveled perception, he will experience a confused chaos of uncontrollable, meaningless forms. Instead of delight at the playful acrobatics of the free intellect, there will be anxious clinging to an elusive order. Morbid and scatological hallucinations may occur, evoking disgust, shame. As before, this negative vision occurs only if the person attempts to control or rationalize the magic panorama. Relax and accept whatever comes. Remember that all visions are created by your mind, the happy and the unhappy, the beautiful and the ugly, the delightful and the horrifying. Your consciousness is creator, performer, and spectator of the retinal circus. If the guide senses that the voyager is in, or seems to be in, the retinal circus vision, he may read to him the appropriate instructions. Vision 7. The Magic Theater. If the voyager was unable to maintain the passive serenity necessary for the contemplation of the previous visions, the peaceful deity, he moves now into a more dramatic and active phase. The play of forms and things becomes the play of heroic figures, superhuman spirits, and demigods. You may see radiating figures in human forms, the lotus lord of dance, the supreme image of a demigod who perceives the effects of all actions, the prince of movement, dancing in an ecstatic embrace with his female counterpart. Heroes, heroines, celestial warriors, male and female demigods, angels, fairies. The exact form of these figures will depend on the person's background and tradition. Archetypal figures in the forms of characters from Greek, Egyptian, Nordic, Celtic, Aztec, Persian, Indian, Chinese mythology. The shapes differ. The source is the same. They are the concrete embodiments of aspects of a person's own psyche. Archetypal forces below verbal awareness and expressible only in symbolic form. The figures are often extremely colorful and accompanied by a variety of awe-inspiring sounds. If the voyager is prepared and in a relaxed, detached frame of mind, he is exposed to a fascinating and dazzling display of dramatic creativity. The cosmic theater, the divine comedy. If his eyes are open, he may visualize the other voyagers as representing these figures. The face of a friend may turn into that of a young boy, a baby, the child god, into a heroic statue, a wise old man, a woman, animal, goddess, sea mother, young girl, nymph, elf, goblin, leprechaun. Images of the great painters arise as the familiar representations of these spirits. The images are inexhaustible and manifold, an illuminating voyage into the areas where the personal consciousness merges with the supra-individual. The danger is that the voyager becomes frightened by or unduly attracted to these powerful figures. The forces represented by them may be more intense than he was prepared for. Inability or unwillingness to recognize them as products of one's own mind leads to escape into animalistic pursuits. The person may become involved in the pursuit of power, lust, wealth, and descend into third bardo rebirth struggles. If the guide senses that the voyager is caught in this trap, the appropriate instructions for Vision 7 may be used. The wrathful visions, second bardo nightmares. 7 second bardo visions have been described. As each one of them, the voyager could recognize what he saw and be liberated. Multitudes will be liberated by that recognition. And although multitudes obtain liberation in that manner, the number of sentient beings being great, evil karma powerful, obscurations dense, propensities of too long standing, the wheel of ignorance and illusion becomes neither exhausted nor accelerated. Despite the confrontations, there is a vast preponderance of those who wander downwards, unliberated. Thus, in the Tibetan Todal, after the 7 peaceful deities, there come 7 visions of wrathful deities, 58 in number, male and female, flame and halo, wrathful, blood-drinking. These herukas, as they are called, will not be described in detail, especially since Westerners are liable to experience the wrathful deities in different forms. Instead of many-headed, fierce mythological demons, they are more likely to be engulfed and ground by impersonal machinery, manipulated by scientific, torturing control devices, and other space fiction horrors. The Tibetans regard the nightmare visions as primarily intellectual products. They assign them to the brain chakra, whereas the peaceful deities are assigned to the heart chakra, and the knowledge-holding deities to the intermediate throat chakra. They are the reactions of the mind to the process of consciousness expansion. They represent the attempts of the intellect to maintain its threatened boundaries. They symbolize the struggle of breaking through to ego loss, understanding, and awareness. Because of the terror and awe they produce, recognition is difficult. Yet, in a way, it is also easier in that since these negative hallucinations command all attention, the mind is alert and, therefore, through trying to escape from fear and terror, people get involved in psychotic states and suffer. But with the aid of this manual and the presence of a guide, the voyager will recognize these hell visions as soon as he sees them and welcome them like old friends. Again, when psychologists, philosophers, and psychiatrists who do not know these teachings experience ego loss, however assiduously they may have devoted themselves to academic study, and however clever they may have been in expounding intellectual theories, certain of the higher phenomena will appear. This is because they are unable to recognize the visions occurring in these psychedelic experiences. Suddenly seeing something they had never seen before, and possessing no intellectual concepts, they view it as and antagonistic feelings arising, they pass into miserable states. Thus, if one has not had practical experience with these teachings, the radiances and lights will not appear. Those who believe in these doctrines, even though they may seem to be unrefined, irregular in performance of duties, inelegant in habits, and perhaps even unable to practice the doctrine successfully, let no one doubt them or be disrespectful towards them, but pay reverence to their mystic faith. That alone will enable them to attain liberation. Elegance and efficiency of devotional practice are not necessary, just acquaintance with and trust in these teachings. Well-prepared persons need not experience second Bardo hell visions at all. Right from the beginning, they can pass into paradisiacal states led by heroes, heroines, angels, and super spirits. They will merge into rainbow radiance. There will be sun showers, sweet scent of incense in the air, music in the skies, radiances. This manual is indispensable to those students who are unprepared. Those proficient in meditation will recognize the clear light at the moment of ego loss and will enter the blissful void, Dharmakaya. They will also recognize the positive and negative visions of the second Bardo and obtain illumination, Sambhogakaya, and, being reborn on a higher level, will become inspired saints or teachers, Nirminakaya. The study and pursuit of enlightenment can always be taken up again at the point where it was broken by the last ego loss, thus ensuring continuity of karma. By the use of this method, enlightenment can be obtained without meditation, through hearing alone. It can liberate even very heavy ego game players. The distinction between those who know it and those who do not becomes very clear. Enlightenment follows instantly. Those who have been reached by it cannot have prolonged negative experiences. The teaching concerning the hell visions is the same as before. Recognize them to be your own thought forms. Relax, float downstream. The appropriate instructions may be read. If, after this, recognition is still impossible and liberation is not obtained, then the voyager will descend into the third Bardo, the period of re-entry. Conclusion of second Bardo. However much experience one may have had, there is always the possibility of delusions occurring in these psychedelic states. Those with practice in meditation recognize the truth as soon as the experience begins. Reading this manual beforehand is important. Having some degree of self-knowledge is helpful at the moment of ego death. Meditation on the various positive and negative archetypal forms is very important for second Bardo phases. Therefore, read this book, keep it, remember it, bear it in mind, read it regularly. Let the words and meanings be very clear. They should not be forgotten, even under extreme duress. It is called the Great Liberation by Hearing, because even those with selfish deeds on their conscience can be liberated if they hear it. If heard only once, it can be efficacious, because even though not understood, it will be remembered during the psychedelic state, since the mind is more lucid then. It should be proclaimed to all living persons. It should be read over the pillows of ill persons. It should be read to dying persons. It should be broadcast. Those who meet this doctrine are fortunate. It is not easy to encounter. Even when read, it is difficult to comprehend. Liberation will be won simply through not disbelieving it upon hearing. Here ends the second Bardo, the period of hallucinations. Third Bardo, the period of re-entry, Sitpa Bardo. Introduction. If, in the second Bardo, the voyager is incapable of holding on to the knowledge that the peaceful and wrathful visions were projections of his own mind, but became attracted to or frightened by one or more of them, he will enter the third Bardo. In this period, he struggles to regain routine reality and his ego. The Tibetans call it the Bardo of seeking rebirth. It is the period in which the consciousness makes the transition from transcendent reality to the reality of ordinary waking life. The teachings of this manual are of the utmost importance if one wishes to make a peaceful and enlightened re-entry and avoid a violent or unpleasant one. In the original Bardo Todo, the aim of the teachings is liberation, i.e., release from the cycle of birth and death. Interpreted esoterically, this means that the aim is to remain at the stage of perfect illumination and not to return to social game reality. Only persons of extremely advanced spiritual development are able to accomplish this by exercising the transference principle at the moment of ego death. For average persons who undertake a psychedelic voyage, the return to game reality is inevitable. Such persons can and should use this part of the manual for the following purposes. 1. To free themselves from third Bardo traps. 2. To prolong the session, thus assuring a maximum degree of illumination. 3. To select a favorable re-entry, i.e., to return to a wiser and more peaceful post-session personality. Although no definite time estimate can be given, the Tibetans estimate that about 50% of the entire psychedelic experience is spent in the third Bardo by most normal people. At times, as indicated in the introduction, someone may move straight to this re-entry period if he is unprepared for or frightened by the ego loss experiences of the first two Bardos. The types of re-entry made can profoundly color the person's subsequent attitudes and feelings about himself and the world for weeks or even months afterwards. A session which has been predominantly negative and fearful can still be turned to great advantage, and much can be learned from it. provided the re-entry is positive and highly conscious. Conversely, a happy and revelatory experience can be made valueless by a fearful or negative re-entry. The key instructions of the third Bardo are 1. Do nothing. Stay calm, passive, and relaxed no matter what happens. And 2. Recognize where you are. If you do not recognize, you will be driven by fear to make a premature and unfavorable re-entry. Only by recognizing can you maintain that state of calm, passive concentration necessary for a favorable re-entry. That is why so many recognition points are given. If you fail on one, it is always possible, up to the very end, to succeed on another. Hence, these teachings should be read carefully and remembered well. In the following sections, some of the characteristic third Bardo experiences are described. In Part 4, instructions are given appropriate to each section. At this stage, in a psychedelic session, the voyager is usually capable of telling the guide verbally what he is experiencing, so that the appropriate sections can be read. A wise guide can often sense the precise nature of the ego's struggle without words. The voyager will usually not experience all of these states, but only one or some of them. Or sometimes the return to reality can take completely new and unusual turns. In such a case, the general instructions for the third Bardo should be emphasized. 1. General description of the third Bardo. Normally, the person descends step by step into lower, more constricted states of consciousness. Each step downwards may be preceded by a swooning into unconsciousness. Occasionally, the descent may be sudden, and the person will find himself jolted back to a vision of reality which, by contrast with the preceding phases, seems dull, static, hard, angular, and puppet-like. Such changes can induce fear and horror, and he may struggle desperately to regain familiar reality. He may get trapped into irrational or even bestial perspectives, which then dominate his entire consciousness. These narrow, primitive elements stem from aspects of his personal history, which are usually repressed. The more enlightened consciousness of the first two Bardos and the civilized elements of ordinary waking life are shelved in favor of powerful, obsessive, primitive impulses, which, in fact, are merely faded and incoherent instinctual parts of the voyager's total personality. The suggestibility of Bardo consciousness makes them seem all-powerful and overwhelming. On the other hand, the voyager may also feel that he possesses supernormal powers of perception and movement, that he can perform miracles, extraordinary feats of bodily control, etc. The Tibetan book definitely attributes paranormal faculties to the consciousness of the Bardo voyager, and explains it as due to the fact that the Bardo consciousness encompasses future elements as well as past. Hence, clairvoyance, telepathy, ESP, etc. are said to be possible. Objective evidence does not indicate whether this sense of increased perceptiveness is real or illusory. We therefore leave them as an open question to be decided by empirical evidence. This, then, is the first recognition point of the third Bardo, the feeling of supernormal perception and performance. Assuming that it is valid, the manual warns the voyager not to be fascinated by his heightened powers and not to exercise In yogic practice, the most advanced of the lamas teach the disciple not to strive after psychic powers of this nature for their own sake, for until the disciple is morally fit to use them wisely, they become a serious impediment to his higher spiritual development. Not until the selfish, game-involved nature of man is completely mastered is he safe using them.
You
A second
stupid
sign of
bitch.
third bardo existence are experiences of panic, torture, and persecution. They are distinguished from the wrathful visions of the second bardo in that they definitely seem to involve the person's own skin-encapsulated ego. Mind-controlling manipulative figures and demons of hideous aspects may be hallucinated. The form that these torturing demons take will depend on the person's cultural background. Where Tibetans saw demons, beasts of prey, a Westerner may see impersonal machinery grinding or depersonalizing and controlling devices of different futuristic varieties. Visions of world destruction, dying in space fiction modes, and hallucinations of being engulfed by destructive powers will likewise come, and sounds of the mind-controlling apparatus, of the combine's fog machinery, of the gears which move the scenery of the puppet show, of angry, overflowing seas, and of the roaring of fire and of fierce winds springing up, and of mocking laughter. When these sounds and visions come, the first impulse will be to flee from them in panic and terror, not caring where one goes, so long as one goes out. In psychedelic drug experiences, the person may, at this time, plead or demand to be brought out of it through antidotes or tranquilizers. The person may see himself as about to fall down deep, terrifying precipices. These symbolize the so-called evil passions, which, like narcotic drugs, enslave and bind mankind to existence in game networks, samsara, anger, lust, stupidity, pride or egoism, jealousy, and control power. Such experiences, just as the previous one of enhanced power, should be regarded as recognizing features of the third bardo. One should neither flee the pain nor pursue the pleasure. Recognition is all that is necessary, and recognition depends upon preparation. A third sign is a kind of restless, unhappy wandering, which may be purely mental or may involve actual physical movement. The person feels as if driven by winds of karma, or shunted around mechanically. There may be brief respites at certain places or scenes in the ordinary human world, like a person traveling alone at night along a highway, having his attention arrested by prominent landmarks, great isolated trees, houses, bridgeheads, temples, hot dog stands, etc. The person in the re-entry period has similar experiences. He may demand to return to familiar haunts in the human world, but any such external placation is temporary, and soon the restless wandering will recommence. There may come a desperate desire to phone or otherwise contact your family, your doctor, your friends, and appeal to them to pull you out of the state. This desire should be resisted. The guide and the fellow voyagers can be of best assistance. One should not try to involve others in one's hallucinatory world. The attempt will fail anyway, since outsiders are usually unable to understand what is happening. Again, merely to recognize these desires as third bardo manifestations is already the first step toward liberation. A fourth rather common experience is the following. The person may feel stupid and full of incoherent thoughts, whereas everyone else seems to be perfectly knowing and wise. This leads to feelings of guilt and inadequacy, and in extreme form, to the judgment vision, to be described later. This feeling of stupidity is merely the natural result of the limited perspective under which the consciousness is operating in this bardo. Calm, relaxed acceptance and trust will enable the voyager to win liberation at this point. Another experience, the fifth recognizing feature, which is especially impressive when it occurs suddenly, is the feeling of being dead, cut off from surrounding life, and full of misery. The person may, with a jolt, awake from some trance-like swoon and experience himself and the others as lifeless robots, performing wooden, meaningless gestures. He may feel that he will never come back and will lament his miserable state. Again, such fantasies are to be recognized as the attempts of the ego to regain control. In the true state of ego death, as it occurs